Hi, Myra. Thank you very much for taking the time today to talk to all of us in your presentation and for this interview. I have some questions for you.
And
And
an interrogation?
it's like an interrogation, but with more light. So I'm going to hand the mic over to you for each response.
Oh, right. Is this like an interrogation? I gotta be louder.
No, it's not like an interrogation. Just some friendly questions.
Okay.
Okay, and we're going to do this as the different parts of your life, beginning with your childhood and kind of moving up into the present. So I'm going to begin with the first question here, and then we'll hand the mic over for each one. Now, how would you generally describe your experience of childhood?
Well, I was raised working class poor, and my mom stayed at home until I was 7, and then she had to start working to make ends meet. But before then, she was staying at home and making everything from scratch. And we were poor, and my older siblings, when they were at home, they would yell a lot at each other and swear a lot. But we went to church on Saturdays, every Saturday. And then in school, let's see, I had a boyfriend in preschool, but I don't think I had any other friends. I followed this boy around and called him my boyfriend. And then in kindergarten, I didn't make any friends, and I was sad because he wasn't there. And then in the first grade, I had a hard time paying attention in class at the public school because I was more interested in what they were teaching in the next room, and it was an open room, so I could see in there, and what they were learning was more advanced. But the teacher said she didn't know what to do with me, so my mom took me and my sister out of public school and put us in Christian school. But later we ended up moving. Well, actually, in the part of the fourth grade, I got to be in the Explorers program for gifted children, but then we moved, and we're going to a church over in Spokane that had a church school. So we went to that church school, and they had me doing a self-paced program, but they made me start at a level that I was way ahead of, so that was frustrating. We weren't allowed to take dolls to that church. Oops.
Maybe they're calling now.
Yeah.
No, we were on. I think we were on school.
Yeah.
Like your experience in Christian school. Okay, so we'll pick it up from here. And as you mentioned earlier, you attended a smaller private school. What was that like?
Well, it was a school that was connected to the church, and there were only 13 students in it, and we were sitting in cubicles facing the wall, which was very impersonal. And the church was this church that wouldn't let us bring dolls with us to school or church because they believed that dolls could carry demons in them. And in fact, some of the kids said that when they took a bunch of dolls to the dump, the dolls were making a bunch of noise. And my sister, one time, to scare me, she said that, oh, I threw away a bunch of Barbie dolls. That's right, because I was afraid of demons being in them. So I threw them away, and the next day my sister said, oh, look at that doll head on the counter. That was facing a different way. I'm like, oh my God. And she's like, and I heard the garbage can tip over last night. I'm like, oh my God. I didn't say God back then. But yeah, I was freaking out. Anyways, this church also, you had to be baptized in the name of Yahweh. They wanted everyone rebaptized in the name of Yahweh. And it was in a bathtub inside of the church. And one of the teenagers told me, I was about 9 or 10 at the time, she told me that that the church was on top of sacred Indian burial ground. So, and I believed her, and I don't think that's true, but it would make make a good horror story. People being baptized in a tub in the name of Yahweh on ancient Indian burial ground. Anyway, so my mom put me in a different Christian school the next year, and then in public school finally, where I didn't fit in and I didn't have nice clothes, and high school was really tough because I didn't fit in there.
Now, you grew up in Spokane, Washington, or was it the 9 Mile Falls area?
I moved to Spokane from Walla Walla when I was 10 years old, and then I lived in Spokane and the Spokane Valley till I was about 14, and then we moved out past 9 Mile Falls. And that was before Lakeside High School was ever set up, so I ended up going to Meade High School.
And how was your relationship with your parents when you were growing up? If you just describe briefly how you got along with them.
I got along okay with my parents, and I was kind of a peacemaker, and I stayed out of trouble, or at least when my parents were around, or I didn't get caught doing anything. I mean, I was out there, my sister, when she was 10, was babysitting me when I was 7, and she would go out shoplifting and take me with her. So I started shoplifting too, but I didn't get caught, and I never got in trouble, hardly ever. And then when I was around my parents, I was just really mild-tempered, mild-mannered. And when the older siblings were yelling at home, I remember going and laying under the bed one time, and it must have been hours before anyone discovered me under the bed, because the yelling had stopped, but still they hadn't noticed that I was not there. So after that, when I was older, my mom and I had told my parents that I was an atheist. When I would go to bed at 9 p.m., my mom would start pounding the organ keys and a Christian tunes, hymnals, and I would be trying to sleep, and I'm like, Mom, I'm trying to sleep. And she's like, well, it's time for me to practice my piano now. So that was irritating.
So clearly, you had a lot of religious influence in your childhood background. How did you perceive the world growing up, just in a really broad sense? Outside of that, how did you see other people outside of your home and family?
Well, I remember I was seeing on the television, they had a commercial about people in Ethiopia, children in Ethiopia being really skinny and starving. So I was really sad about that. And I remember when I first learned about the idea of having homes for everyone, I thought that sounded like a good idea. And when I first learned what communism is, I thought that was a good idea too, because I thought everyone should have food to eat and housing to live in.
Now, what was high school like for you after you moved past all of that? What was that experience like, socially and academically?
High school was like hell for me. I mean, academically, I was doing okay until, well, mostly I did okay. I got A's and B's, and I flunked a sewing class because I didn't want to do sewing anymore, and I was having a hard time looking at I'd gotten an A the quarter before, but then I was trying to get put in, I wanted to transfer to an academic class, and the teacher wouldn't let me. She said it's too late in the season. So she flunked me the next quarter when I wasn't doing much. Actually, it was trimester. But socially, I didn't do too well. I had made a few friends that I hung out with, and one of my friends got me into smoking cigarettes. And then something terrible happened to me in high school, and my friends started treating me like crap, but I still followed them around because I didn't want to just have no friends. But yeah, they treated me like crap after something happened, and I'm not going to get into that.
Did you say you got along better with people that were kind of on the fringes in high school, like you're um, sort of the outcast, the goth and the metal kids? I always liked those people.
Well, I thought goth people were pretty interesting. I didn't have any goth friends at high school, though. I was really shy, so I didn't make friends easily. And at my church that I went to, there was this girl there that was a goth she moved to Springdale from California, like San Jose. So she was suddenly in Hickville and complaining about all of the Hicks. But yeah, she got me into listening to The Cure and the Smiths. And we're still friends to this day. And she's a pagan now, and I'm an atheist, so we're still friends, and she's part of Food Not Bombs, in fact, now. So I was friends with a few stoners in high school, but I didn't smoke weed until I was like 18.
Now, did you start working while you were in high school? What was your first job?
Yes, I started working when I was in high school at McDonald's when I was about 16. And I worked at McDonald's for a few years.
Now, I worked there myself, but similar point in my life. It really changed the way that I saw economics. I saw how people were treated in a place like that. Did that have any effect on the way you saw, like, how the world worked?
Well, at the time, I took everything personally, so if people were mistreating me, I blamed myself. And I was really difficult to work with because I was fucking up orders left and right, like every day. Like, I would just always screw stuff up. And so people didn't want to work with me, none of the workers or the supervisors. So for 2 years, I got treated like hell until I could finally got with the program. And then when I got with the program, I started being bossy, and I wanted to be that shot caller that was shouting out the shots for everyone, you know. So I went through a period of time when I was doing that, though nobody wanted to put up with that from me.
And it just had to reminded me of an incident that I had when I was there. I decided to go to work on LSD because it seemed like a brilliant idea. And I kept putting 2 bun crowns together with ketchup on them and sending them up the line until I got sent home. And it could be a rough place. You're probably glad when you moved on to something better.
Well, I moved on when I moved to California with my ex-husband. And so I actually applied at a McDonald's out there, but I also applied at a coffee shop, and the coffee shop called me and wanted to hire me. So it was all right. I was working there were a lot of yuppie customers, but it was a different environment than the McDonald's environment for sure. Instead of rude people that were yelling at their kids, it was rude people who were just being snobby, but in a different manner. So anyway, it was nice to work at a coffee shop once I got the hang of it. At first, they weren't treating me very well. One of the girls that I worked with said that I didn't have any personality. But I was really quiet and shy at first. It takes me a while to settle in and get comfortable. But it was a really hard time in my life. I mean, I had a baby, and the baby was wonderful. But my ex-husband would come home and get mad at me because his socks were on the floor. I'm like, those are your socks. You have to pick up after yourself. He'd get mad at me for not cleaning perfectly. And so we would get into arguments, but he would be able to outshout me and make me cry. And then he would get angry at me when I cried. But when I wasn't dealing with the ex-husband, I was either at work or at home with my baby boy, and it was really nice to be a mother.
Would you say that difficult period of your life and the job and with your husband and the young child, would you say that may have created pressures that changed your life down the road?
I think so, because I got so adamant about defending myself that I developed a really rebellious spirit at the time. But at some point, I was just being really passive with my ex-husband because nothing was working. So I started acting really cold with him, and I didn't want him touching me or anything. And I was telling him for a couple of years before we split up, I was telling him that I was going to leave him. And he's like, oh, okay. He's like, well, at first he was sad, but then he just acted like I wasn't going to do it. But I'm like, well, I just need to make more money. So when we finally moved to Spokane and we both got settled in with jobs, I was trying to get hired on for better pay at the Guardian life insurance, and I finally got the job. And I knew that as soon as I got my tax return, I'd be able to leave him. But when I did finally leave him, he's like, "You're not leaving me." I'm like, "Yes, I am. I just got my tax return."
So that position at the Guardian was kind of opened some doors for you to move on from that marriage. What made you decide to return to school?
Well, I had a problem with fatigue, for one thing. Secondly, I had a problem with, I hated my job at the Guardian, actually. It was really stressful. It was customer service. I wasn't that great at it. I wanted a job that I was passionate about, and I figured if I was passionate about a job, that I would be able to have lots of energy because my passion would give me energy. Also, I wanted to understand the world better, so I went back to school and met some really cool people at the SFCC Communicator, where I met you.
Now you went back to school. You were, I think you were about 30, if I remember correctly. Was it difficult to adapt to that academic environment after being away for a while?
You know, it wasn't too hard to adapt. I just had a problem with my English composition class when I started taking that, because I was under the impression that I had good writing skills and was good at spelling. But when I first wrote something that the instructor acted like it was total crap. He said, "Your spelling's atrocious." And then he needed me to add more details and stuff to it. So I worked so hard on the English composition, and I finally did another paper where that he was satisfied with, and then it went to be judged, and the other instructor acted like it was really good. But I learned later that she acts like everyone's writing is great, because telling people that they're great at something makes them great.
That's a fair point. It does help. What piqued your interest in journalism during that time period?
I'm not really sure what piqued my interest in journalism.
Well, I'll tell you that I got into that class because I signed up too late for anything else, literally, and that was all that was available. So that's how I found myself there. But it was interesting to me on a technical level and otherwise, and I wound up being really glad that I took that one, as I did meet some great people there. The Communicator was the name of the paper, as you recall. What were some of your best memories of that experience?
Well, I didn't go to the late night parties at the college with some of you. I guess I heard that Steve did cocaine at one of those college adventures, but I wasn't there. I had a baby at home and a a part-time job. 30 hours a week. And then I was really being on my schedule and staying on top of my schedule. But I liked the articles that Sean McKelvey wrote. And I sort of fell in love with Sean McKelvey, even though he was 10 years younger than me. And apparently he was gay, but I didn't know that at the time. Nobody knew that. He was in the closet. But he wrote a lot of anti-Bush stuff and anti-war stuff and anti-sweatshop stuff. And I just fell in love with his writing. And then I enjoyed writing some of the articles that I wrote, even though they didn't have anything to do with the current news. They were one of them I wrote about something back from 1992. I wrote about how we should, how people in the military should be able to be openly gay. This was before the Obama administration. So at the time, we were still going by the don't ask, don't tell policy. But I was writing about this when it didn't come out in the news at all. There was nothing about it. I just suddenly wrote about it. And then I wrote an article called Let's Go to Hell Together. And Sean McKelvey was impressed with that.
It was during that time period that you sort of broke out of the kind of box that your life had been in for a lot of it. I guess, how did the political climate of that time help push you in those directions? It was a pretty strange time.
Well, after college, I started the Finger with you and Seth and some others, and was introduced to a lot of people in the anarchist community that were fighting, were anti-war and anti-Bush, and were for feeding people, and I met people that were into communism or supporting the homeless, and I opened the bookstore and was introduced to AK Press literature. So I read a book in there about anarchism, and that was really interesting because we wouldn't have this global marketplace. And I knew capitalism was a problem. From one of my classes, I realized that it was unsustainable. And so when I read this book on anarchism, it started making sense. If we didn't have this monetary system, if it was all trade and barter, if we didn't have this mass production of goods around the globe and mass exploitation of the world's natural resources, then we wouldn't be in over our heads.
Now, you had a lot of, that's the proverbial irons in the fire that summer after that semester of college. You helped co-found the Finger, the newspaper, and also developed the concept for the bookstore, all within a few months of each other. What was your energy level like at that period, mentally and otherwise?
Well, my mental energy and physical energy was great for a while. While I was going to college, I was pretty exhausted, but I kept on pushing myself through it. And it would help that I'd have classes that I was passionate about. That helped me drive myself. But when we opened the bookstore, I had quit my job, so for 2 weeks, we were not doing a whole lot except talking about ideas and going to get a business license and stuff. And so then for a while, I had a lot of energy stored up. And then I started working really long days at the bookstore, and that was fine for a while, but it did catch up to me after a while.
So there were a lot of pressures around all of the things that you had to contend with in that period. You still were raising your son. You were dealing with the bookstore. You were dealing with stuff with the paper. And how did the store was open about 5 months, somewhere in that area. How did that all unfold? Just a capsule vision of that.
Well, I opened the bookstore on a whim with a credit card, and then I had a few friends that were helping out, like you and Seth and some others that we had been getting together anyways to talk about the finger because we were producing a newspaper. And then Seth had always wanted to have a bookstore and live in a bookstore, so I let him live in the back of that store. And then he ran the finger out of the bookstore. So we had people stopping by to visit the bookstore that would help out with the newspaper. And we had furniture in there in bright orange walls. And I remember when we first painted the orange walls, you were getting tired of painting, so you wrote, "Fuck this," on the wall.
That might still be there. Now, the scene was a bit chaotic, if I recall correctly. You had the front of the store with the books and that legitimate business. And in the back, it was more like something out of Animal Farm. There was Seth's area. And then there were the punk rock shows, which were pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Now, when it finally drew to a close, what were some of the pressures around the operation of the store? You mentioned in your the talk today about the business difficulties imposed by the bridge closure and some of the other things. What were some of your thoughts on the how it came to an end?
Well, I wasn't making enough money. I thought I'd be making more money off of books to be investing in more books and to be paying the bills, but that wasn't coming to fruition, and I couldn't just keep the bookstore open with my credit card. So I had to quit that. Plus, something else gave me a motive to hurry up and do it, because when I was away in Seattle, you were with me. We were visiting my sister over in Seattle, and I left Seth in charge of the bookstore. And then I got a phone call from the realtor, and he said that he didn't want the book house, he didn't want that store to be a flop house, because he complained about a mattress being in the back, and then he's like, "I didn't rent this out to you for it to be a flop house."
It's an old-timey way to describe that now, wasn't it? But when you did have to close up, a lot of your inventory wound up going into storage, and some of it went with you. When you were talking earlier today about some of the hoarding things that were ultimately going on in your space, do you think having to carry some of that around with you made that more difficult?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
A lot of the inventory from the bookstore had to be placed in storage, as you recall, and a lot of it wound up in your house, and you sort of had to take it with you at various places. Did that contribute to the development of some of the hoarding things that you wound up dealing with later on?
Yeah, well, some of the stuff that I had in my collection came from the bookstore. I mean, I had hundreds and hundreds of books. And I had let some people adopt the books, where I let them take home a couple of books from the bookstore. So they were going to hold on to books for me, because I was going to open another bookstore later. I planned on it. But so some people kept a few books, but most of those books ended up in my apartment and in storage, and then in my apartment, and then with me when I lived with my ex-boyfriend Adam. And when I moved into his place, I was trying to bring everything over, but then he didn't plan on moving any of the furniture around to accommodate mine, so we had to figure out what to do. I don't remember how we resolved that, because I thought that I could just move in and move stuff around, and that he'd be okay with it, and he thought that I could just move in and be okay with not having all my stuff with me. So we resolved it somehow. I don't know if either of us were happy with it, but our hallways were stacked up with all kinds of clutter. You saw it.
It did have a certain charm to it in places. Perfect segue for the next question. I wondered if you could briefly describe your time in Brown's Addition and near Brown's Addition, the years you were living downtown, and your time with Adam there.
Well, when I first started living in Brown's Addition, I was staying at Nikki's place and going to college. That was before I met my ex-boyfriend, Adam. And she was letting me live there, and that's before I filed bankruptcy. So I was staying there and paying big bills on my credit cards because I had racked up I owed a lot. So I finally went bankrupt, and then I moved into my own apartment in Brown's Addition. And my ex-boyfriend Adam found me on Facebook, not Facebook, MySpace, where I was had a radical presence on MySpace, and he found me, and he thought that I reminded him of how he was like when he was like a 20-year-old guy tripping on acid and complaining about politics. So, and going to noise shows. I didn't go to noise shows, but something about my presence reminded himself of a younger him. And then I moved in with my ex-boyfriend Adam near Brown's Addition, kind of in between Brown's Addition and downtown in the San Marcos building, and we lived there for a few years, and then we moved into a smaller apartment because I stopped working. I was having problems with chronic fatigue. We couldn't afford to live there, so we moved into the Bueno Vista and lived in a smaller apartment, and that was really close, right by the Rocket Bakery. So I lived there with him for a couple of years, and then it just wasn't working out with us. I mean, he's always busy with research, and his research is awesome, but he just doesn't make time for relationships.
Sounded like he was a bit distant or self-involved with his own projects there. Might be a difficult subject, but the period around the end of that relationship seemed to dovetail with some of the other things that happened to you, your change of location and all of that stuff. If you could briefly describe like how that period came to an end.
So we were, before we split up, I told him I wanted to be polyamorous. So I, anyways, met this guy at the bar that worked there and had a short thing with him. That didn't go very far. We just went out a couple of times, and that was it. And then me and my ex-boyfriend had gotten in a fight, and I finally left, and I went and I spent some of the time at my parents' and some of the time couch surfing while trying to get into HUD housing. I had gotten into the supportive living program, and they were helping me get into housing. So I finally got into the Coeur d'Alene Plaza. And I wasn't dating anyone for a while, but in theory I was solo polyamorous.
So that after that period of going from couch to couch ended, it was HUD that got you into the place above Boo Radley's, right?
Well, it was HUD housing, but the program that helped me with this was the supportive living program.
Now, how was it there in the Coeur d'Alene building at first? Like, how was your experience of the place, the neighborhood, and your neighbors? What was it like there early on?
Well, early on, I was a little bit bored there. Made a couple of friends, but I didn't have anything to talk about with them, and so I was kind of bored. I'd go play with music online and listen to Spotify music, and I lost my train of thought. Yeah.
We're going over just the early part of your time in the Coeur d'Alene apartments, what the overall experience was like in the first days that you were there.
So the first days I was there, I was kind of bored. I was really quiet. I didn't have a lot of people over. The maintenance guy, Lorne, was flirting with me, and he flirted with me a few times. And I had shown vague interest, but then he told me he had a part-time job as a used car salesman. And I was like, oh my God. So, but it was a job for him, and so it put him in a house, but he kept acting interested in me. So I think that later on that could have led to him keeping an eye on my place and being jealous.
So that may have led him to some degree of retaliation in your view. Seems reasonable. Sounds like some unwanted pressure there. Now, it was while you were at the Coeur d'Alene apartments that a lot of the issues you've had seem to emerge a lot more strongly. What do you think the roots of that were during your time there?
I just started partying with some people that lived in the building, and I started getting a lot of creative energy for making art projects, and I got really ambitious when I wasn't busy partying with friends. I was busy working on art, and I started doing some storytelling to myself when I was in my apartment. And I don't know, I mean, I had gone from not having much energy to having a lot of energy. So I got really excited and ambitious, and then all of a sudden I felt like I thought I was being spied on, and these people didn't believe that I had chronic fatigue syndrome or was slow or anything like that. And these were siblings and neighbors and some other people that they brought in to spy on me.
No, it sounds a bit like you wound up having some isolation going on while you had some of that energy. And do you think, sort of make that experience more severe?
Well, I wasn't too isolated before the spy operation started because I would spend some time at a couple of neighbors' homes, or some people would stop by my home to visit. It was as soon as I thought there was a spy operation was going on, I stopped letting anyone come into my apartment and became really isolated for a while.
And you had developed quite the art aesthetic during your time there. I remember seeing some of the pieces you were working on. If you could please describe some of the projects you were doing and what inspired those.
Well, it's hard to describe my art. I was trying to make a paper mache cupboard for one thing, and then I was trying to make this one. I had a lot of alien forms going on that I was creating from like scraps from, I had saved duct tape and blank tape and stuff, and I was picking up chalk crumbs with it, pastel chalk crumbs with it, and using that in my art, and I was making a lot of alien forms and other creative stuff that it looked like junk to my parents, I'm sure, so I don't think my dad saw it as a big deal for me to move my art projects into his storage to keep my apartment. But to me, it was like I had put so much time and energy into these art projects that I could not imagine that. But as far as influences, well, I think for one thing, Seth had what he called the slut, which was a mannequin that he dressed up with a lot of stuff. And then we had Bobby, or Karate Bob, which later became Karate Bobby, that we were dressing up and people had written all over with Sharpie ink. And so I think those were creative influences. Let's see, there was Portlandia, where in Portlandia, Carrie Brownstein says, all you got to do is put a bird on it and it's art in Portland. So it was just kind of that idea of just it was also the idea of creating with what you already have, trying to figure out how to make usefulness out of the leftover scraps and leftover objects.
There almost did seem to be a bit of art imitating life with Portlandia, because I think some of the things we had going on around there were sketch-worthy themselves. I remember the slut being taken to visit Chuck Palahniuk at Auntie's bookstore when he signed it. Still have pictures of that. It was definitely a work of art. But wanted to ask you a bit about the blue motif you had with some of those pieces. You really had this spectacular kind of dreamlike wall of blue objects that you had created. Was there anything that kind of shaped your creativity overall during that whole period, beyond the reuse?
Well, I wanted paint, and my dad wouldn't take me to the incinerator to get any paint because he didn't want to be an accessory to me destroying my place. So there was a guy that came to visit me that he wanted to trade something. He wanted to sell something. I'm like, can you get me some paint? They're like, oh yeah, my parents have paint in their garage. I'll bring you some paint. So he gave me a bunch of 2 buckets of blue paint for $15. And so that's why so much of the stuff was blue.
That explains it really well, but it had something to it. Now, I wanted to sort of segue into some of what you were dealing with as far as not only your fatigue, but the psychological issues. What was your experience like with the medical providers as you started seeking assistance with those things?
Well, when I first got diagnosed with fibromyalgia, I was in severe pain all over. My ex-boyfriend, who was my boyfriend at the time, would hardly pay any attention to me. And when I went to the medical profession telling them I was in severe pain all over, they acted like I could just take Prozac or Neurontin, wait a few months, and be okay. And I'm like, I am in severe pain all over. And they also were worried about me trying to get drugs and just making stuff up to use drugs. And I mean, I remember going to urgent care on a Friday night, and that person there wouldn't give me any medication to take, and he acted like I just needed a psychiatrist. So I was really angry at the medical profession, and I guess 50% of pain patients are angry at the medical profession. So, and my anger, I don't know what comes first, because when you're angry, you tense up, and that creates pain, but being in pain will make you angry. So it just sort of increases.
It would seem like some of that dismissal and suspicion that was inflicted on you while you were seeking help, it sounds almost like it might have influenced some of the things you were hearing, that sense of being attacked, voices asking whether you were malingering or making things up. Did you see a connection, or at least in the present, do you see a connection between how you were treated in reality and how that might have spiraled into some of the other things?
No, I don't really see a connection. I mean, I still think that there's a strong possibility there was a real spy operation, and that my siblings got a hold of some of my paperwork from when I was going to apply for Social Security, and they were going through it all and saying, oh, she's not slow, oh, she's not that, no, she's just full of crap. So I think it was my siblings getting a hold of stuff and not understanding what my problems were. I didn't spend time with my siblings. They didn't know what I was like, and they decided, instead of just getting to know me as a real person, to just spy on me and get to know me from a distant screen and by talking to me through a speaker in my home.
It seemed like you endured a lot of cruelty from people that probably should have cared more about you. It doesn't seem unreasonable at all that you might have felt that way about the larger world. When you first discovered the spy situation, what were your very first impressions of that being a reality?
I'm not sure. It's hard to say. Well, at one point, I heard my sister Carrie's voice, and it sounded like there was feedback from a speaker, and she said, "Myra, I want you to know that you're not hearing things." And one of the early things I heard was also the apartment manager, Mary Her, saying, "Is she up to the lie test?" And then I heard my siblings calling me fake. And my brother David's voice was saying something too. Like he said, "You're clueless."
Now, about how long would you say that the peak of that experience lasted? Just was it a span of months, or did it persist over a longer period?
The peak of it lasted for a few months until I lost my apartment, but then I continued to have thought I was hearing stuff after that. It was more mild and not as many people, but I couldn't tell if the thoughts were in my head or if I was hearing something like was implanted in my ear really deep, and I was hearing really quiet noise from that. I wasn't able to think rationally about it, but I do know that it was mostly just my sister's voice in my head and my sister Joyce's voice in my head and another male voice, and they would just be watching like me go to the Evergreen Club and watching what I was doing at the Evergreen Club and talking about how I was capable.
So it was like you almost had a small army of spies following you around everywhere you went. That was sounds like your impression of it. It must have been very difficult to just go about your business daily, dealing with that. When did you first approach Frontier?
Well, oddly enough, I was already going to Frontier Behavioral Health when the spy operation started, because when I was busy making all of this expressive art and trying to make a paper mache cupboard, my mom was really worried about me, and she wanted me to get in for professional help. So this could have been a factor for, this could have caused my siblings to actually be concerned about me and think they needed to spy on me, because she might have told my siblings that she had concerns about me. And she reached out to my ex-boyfriend Adam too and was worried about me. And then she got me into medical help, and it was shortly after that that the spy operation started.
So when you were pursuing services through Frontier, and I have some experience with them myself, I found them to be absolutely fantastic, very supportive in terms of helping people deal with things. What was that like for you? What benefit did you derive from being involved there?
Well, I was able to stay really busy. I went to the Evergreen Club. They gave me a referral to the Evergreen Club and a referral to a supportive living program so I could go to the activities with them. And also I got to go to different groups, which would help with coping skills. I took coping skills for the Wise Mind, which is basically dialectical behavioral therapy. And I was meeting a lot of nice people there, and I would go to Frontier Behavioral Health early for appointments and drink coffee, because they used to serve coffee there. So you could kind of sit there and hang out before your appointment and go to group, and you'd meet people out in the lobby. So I was making a lot of friends there. And yeah, I was just making a lot of friends, and I was able to stay busy, which helped when I was homeless. Because when you're homeless, I didn't like going to the Hearth. The Women's Hearth is a drop-in shelter for women, but I didn't make any friends there and didn't know what to talk about with anyone. And I didn't like going to the bus plaza because the bus plaza, it was a really noisy environment, and that didn't agree with me at the time because I was already stressed out, traumatized by all these voices.
As you're well aware, the current political climate in Spokane is very interested in the problem of homelessness, and some of the solutions are fairly harsh and attack some of the very places and institutions that you were describing. When you were homeless, what was your overall experience with how people treated you in general if you were out in public? Was it any different than when you weren't homeless?
I was mostly interacting with people that were homeless or got services at Frontier Behavioral Health. And I wasn't talking to old friends because I thought a lot of people had spied on me. I thought even you had spied on me and a bunch of other people. So I wasn't reaching out to people much. I mostly was isolated from the mainstream society. One time I went to, when I was trying to stay busy and find stuff to do before going back to the homeless shelter, one time I went to the Marmot Art Space, which is across the street from the Inlander. And I went there and I saw somebody that I had worked with at SCC, and I told her that I had gotten diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she's like, well, are you sure about that? You might want to ask a friend and get a second opinion. And I didn't tell her the whole story, so I just said hi to her, and she said I looked good, even though I had my bags with me. And I told her I was homeless. She's like, well, you look good. So aside from that, I was mostly isolated from mainstream society.
And there's clearly a great deal of ignorance and dismissal of a lot of issues of mental health that people have. I have to say I've experienced a little bit of that myself. Now, you really seem to be, at this point in your life, enjoying somewhat of a renaissance, creatively and otherwise. Has it been sort of a long road back for you, back to this place where you're beginning to do a lot of work again?
I guess it's been a long road back. I mean, while I was homeless, I played pretend at being an anthropologist. So I was never just sitting still doing nothing. I was sitting still thinking and sitting still learning and learning about something that I plan to write about later. And I wanted to start writing about the spy operation sooner, but it was so emotional for me. One time when I was at the shelter, I had all these ideas in my head that I wanted to get out on paper. But then when I got my journal out and climbed out of my bunk bed at night and went to go write, I couldn't. So then I was going to take the day off from the Evergreen Club and go write, but I was an emotional wreck. I just couldn't write. So I had to wait. So it's been a bit of a long road back. It's still really hard to write about because it stirs up old memories and brings up, I relive trauma when I write about this stuff. I mean, there were some fun times during this spy operation too, when I was dancing and singing to Oingo Boingo and just being a total brat with the voices. So sometimes I felt like I was on top of my game, and other times I felt like they were just killing me.
So you did have some moments there where you were on top of it. And I really appreciate you taking the time not only to speak about this today and answer these questions, but to do this writing, and certainly hope it has a widespread impact. Now, what are your immediate plans for the future?
Well, I have lots of ideas. I need to pace myself so that I don't end up having a problem with energy and pain. In fact, I've been having problems with neck tension, and part of that's from leaning over my computer and not having an ergonomic setup, and some of it's from emotional pain and tensing up from it. And so I need to pace myself, but I do want to finish 6 essays the first year. I've written 1 so far. and then I want to put together a book and sell it. And then I have lots of ideas. I want to get together with you in February and use the Level Up classroom upstairs in the library and do video conferencing with some people that we used to work with the Finger and the bookstore years ago, and do that project. Another project I'd like to do would be to go to Goodwill outlet store, get lots of neat fabrics and stuff, bring them home, and take scissors and safety pins to the clothes and make some really interesting outfits and do a video dress up and take some photos and stuff. I do want to get back into writing about religion and politics because that's what I started my blog about in the first place. So I might back up with the article about God being a genocidal dictator. And apparently that's not such an original, brand new idea. Like, I didn't see stuff out there when I Googled it, but apparently it's been written about plenty, so I need to find the literature that's already out there about it and read some of that and then do a review or a reflection on it. And maybe I'll finish reading the Bible too and add in my 2 cents. That's a lot of reading. So, and I'd like to become scholarly on the issue of homelessness because I already have a body of knowledge about homelessness and experience with that would be a good subject for me to learn more about. And I'm sure I want to do video skits, like video skits of the bookstore, video skits of the spy operation, video skits of the Finger and related to projects like that, or pretending to be Carrie Brownstein and Fred Armisen.
It seems like you've got a lot of material for some autobiographical material, whether comedy or otherwise. Have you ever considered having anybody else adapt any of your stories in the future?
Oh, I've thought of the idea of the spy operation being turned into a movie. When I was going through the spy operation, I felt like I had woken up in a sci-fi movie or 1984, and I thought that it would make for a good movie.
I would not hesitate to agree with that. That's no artifice there. It would be a pretty compelling thing to watch on many different levels. Now, the last question for you here, how do you like your new home, your new neighborhood? What's it like up in Hilliard now?
Well, I won't say exactly where I live in Hilliard, but mostly I'm quiet. I hang out with a neighbor of mine, Michaela, and hang out with her some. But aside from that, I am at home alone a lot, or I'm going off to town to go to like SLP activities and whatnot, and counseling. Now I'm back in weekly counseling because I'm processing all of this stuff from my past. So I'm not paying much attention to what's going on in my neighborhood. Well, actually, I remember somebody saying that this one guy that lived in the neighborhood he got back into meth and heroin, and he was on the run from Satan, and he was riding in his car, driving 60 miles an hour because he thought Satan was following him, and he hit some kid on a scooter and killed him. So now he's in prison. Oh, and when I first moved in there was a guy that lived next door, and I didn't talk to him at all and didn't know anything about him, but apparently he got shot by some police in the stomach several times because when the police came over to evict him, he kept on, under a blanket, he kept on reaching. It looked like he was reaching for a gun, In fact, he had gone to a gun show 2 weeks earlier with one of the neighbors. But it looked like he was reaching for the gun, so the police officer shot him a few times, and amazingly, he survived. But he didn't come back to our apartment building again. So, and he survived. So hopefully he's doing okay and is not buying guns.
It is a hard world. But we're going to wrap up for today. But again, I wanted to thank you very much for taking the time to answer these sometimes painful questions. And want to wish you the absolute best for all of your future endeavors. And thanks again.
Thank you so much.
I think that's a wrap.